It's really important to research outside of art in order to make your art better. So Bones and I have a comic about cat knights. It's called The Scourge of 9 Point. Going into the project, knew very, very little about knights and medieval anything. We didn't know anything about armor, we didn't know anything about swords or medieval fighting styles or medieval architecture. We'd only ever seen, Dungeons and Dragons heroes, or movies about knights and sword fighting, or anime about knights and sword fighting. And don't get me wrong, we have definitely seen media that can be very accurate to the time periods, but upon researching into medieval stuff and knights, it's very clear that in movies and comics and books, there's a lot of inaccuracies. And sometimes it's very clear the people who made the piece of media, whether it's like a movie or book or whatever, clearly they didn't do their research. There's tons of inaccuracies. There's things that don't make sense. And sometimes they will do something inaccurate, even if they've done all their research, even though everything is very clearly very accurate. Sometimes they will do things that aren't accurate for the sake of it looking cool or it making more sense to the audience. But a lot of this media is very misleading about the time period that we are inspired by to make our comic. So recently, Bones and I have been doing tons of research about medieval fashion, about fighting techniques used by knights, and just general, martial arts. Admittedly, we've been doing this research for a while. Bones has done quite a lot of research as he writes the script for 9 Point, and I'm slowly getting into the visual research. So Bones, he needed to look up, what different fighting techniques were utilized, like cavalry and fighting on horseback, versus what does someone who's not a knight, what kind of weapon do they carry around? Or how were medieval cities built so that he can write the proper layout of a city? And he needs to research all these things so that he doesn't have a character walking through town with a sword that is completely not a thing that ever existed historically, if that makes sense. So he'll do a lot of research about, kind of what technology existed, what things were common, just so that he doesn't write anything that is totally impossible, or, he's not writing something that only ever appeared in, the Victorian era that never actually showed up in medieval era. And then I need to do the visual research to make sure that I'm not drawing characters in clothing that is inaccurate to the medieval era. And much like the media I was criticizing earlier, there are definitely going to be inaccuracies in our comic. It's medieval inspired, but it's still a fantasy. A lot of things would develop differently just based on how the societies are built in 9 Point and the anatomy of the characters, because 9 Point is all animals. Cats, for the most part, are the knights, so armor would be built differently for a cat anthro than for a human. And of course, we're going to be doing things that are, they might look cool, they're inaccurate, but they're cool and they add to the aesthetic or the fun of the story, and that's totally okay. I was criticizing it, but that's fine. No judgment on that. If it's cool, do it. But it's very important that we do the research to make sure that we know what we're breaking, I guess. If we know how things are done properly, we can decide, instead of out of ignorance making a mistake, we can say, well, it was actually like this, they fought, I don't know, they wore armor like this, but we're gonna change it because we want this. Maybe it just puts my mind to rest, but I feel a lot better going into a project doing that. Because as soon as you go into anything that has, a bunch of fanatics behind it, and I use that term very endearingly, but to say, there are a ton of people who are really into medieval fighting and knights, and if they ever read our comic and they were like, this is really inaccurate, it could definitely pull them out of the story. So it's nice to be able to, I guess if anyone ever, calls you on something, you can say, yeah, I know, but this was cooler. I guess maybe that makes me feel better. You definitely don't have to go into your stories like that, but I find it super endearing when I go into a comic or a book or a movie, whatever, and I see a lot of love into the subject of it. it makes me feel good, especially when it's a subject I'm also into. So I really love like historical fiction and historical fantasy specifically. So if I'm reading a book about the 1920s and it is so immersive and they get so much stuff like correct about the time period and, you know, from slang to like how the characters dressed to the atmosphere of the story, like that is like wonderful deliciousness for my heart. It's very fun. And I find it just makes for more interesting work as well. There's so much stuff in reality that is like far more interesting than if you just make it up in your head, I guess. And I think it just falls into you don't know what you don't know, if that makes sense. Because if you're figuring out like a fantasy world and there's all this stuff that's already been made about like, you know, swords and armor and how people dressed and how castles are built and how effective weapons are built. You know, there's so much fashion history, there's so much like weapon history, architecture. There's so much that's already there that someone else has figured out that's like full of like detail and richness that you can, I guess it just takes all the work out from trying to make it. It takes out all the potential plot holes that you could make. I guess the best analogy I have for it is like when I'm drawing a character, say they're in like modern clothing, like modern like shorts and t-shirt. If I just draw them from the top of my head, it is going to be a blank t-shirt. The shorts might not have seams. They might not sit properly on the character. It might turn out boring, potentially. But if I go and grab a reference and I look at how the shorts are actually sewn together, if I see where the seams are, I can see how different people decorate shorts or a t-shirt. I can look at different cuts of a t-shirt. I can look at different cuts of shorts. I can look at accessories people wear with them. There's a lot more richness and, I guess, like diversity you can bring to something very simple. You think drawing armor would be very simple, you might end up drawing it so that they could never move in that armor, if you're just drawing it off the top of your head. In fact, that's one of the big like criticisms I see all the time when I'm like researching armor, is that they look at fantasy armor and this expert will be like, well, this character can't articulate their gauntlets. They can't move their fingers because the gauntlets aren't built correctly, or they would never be able to bend at the waist. Whereas like actual armor allows you to move and bend because you need to move when you're fighting. So like there's so much stuff like that you miss if you try to make it up on your own. And yeah, and it just adds extra flavor to things. I think it's just a personal pet peeve, but I really don't like going into stories where things feel very bland and they feel very like derivative of other works, I guess. I know there's a rule in design when I was learning how to do website design and that stuff. I was told very early on to understand why people are doing things. So like, why do you set up a web page like this? Why do you set up a navigation bar like this? And it's important to know why instead of just copying, say, like Amazon or copying, you know, how YouTube is formatted. It's important to understand why Amazon chose to set up their navigation like that, or why YouTube chose to set up their web page like that, because you start to see the logic in it instead of just copying it and getting stuff wrong. So I guess that's my problem with when I feel like I'm getting so negative. Oh no. I just love when things have that like richness that research brings. And I also know that like when you are searching for like a story idea or a design idea for like a character or world building or whatever it is, whatever you're working on, when you just try to come up with things in a vacuum, it's really hard. It puts so much extra stress on you. So like, dig into some research, study things you're really passionate about. If you're really into animals, bring all that love and research about animals that you have. If you love medieval fighting, look into that. If you like math, bring math into your stories. I know when I was told this by like a writing podcast I like, Writing Excuses. They said that like books that have like roots in other things besides fiction can be a lot more interesting, I guess. I mean, for example, if you look at Tolkien's work. So if you look at Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, Tolkien was a linguist. That is why in his books there are a million different made-up languages of like the dwarves and the elves, and he would write poetry, and he had these very like well thought out like worlds and societies, and part of that was because he also was really into folklore, and he wanted to write I guess like a mythology or a folklore for Britain, because he felt like it didn't have anything like that a lot of other cultures had. And you can see like the things he loved. I mean folklore is kind of literature. He pulled inspiration from something other than reading other people's works, I guess, if that makes sense. And when I started trying to make stories, I was really discouraged because I thought like, well, I only really like fiction. I really like reading books, and I want to make comics and stories that are like the books that I love. But the truth is, I do have lots of interests outside of fiction and narrative. And like fiction and narrative are a big part of my life, but like I also love animals. I also love historical settings. I also love skeletons. I'm into horror and true crime, and, you know, there's so many other things to my life than just reading fiction. So, like, bring your interests into your work and research them thoroughly, because you'll have fun if it's something you're into. And it brings so much authenticity to your work. Basically, Bones and I watched a bunch of stuff about sword fighting today, and I'm really hype. And I want to go draw cats attacking each other with swords. Okay, I should really talk about Callum and Wolf. Guess which one is Wolf? So Callum and Wolf are from one of our fairy RPs. We have many. They're from the same RP as Eve and Cordelia from like episode 2 of this Inktober. Wolf and Callum definitely kicked off the RP that they are in. They kind of created the inciting incident of the story. So what happened was, Callum, he is the prince of this kingdom called Everspring. He has a sister, he has a twin sister who's really mean to him. His parents are very overbearing, the king and queen, and he's very quiet and meek. And he is also a gay boy, and in his kingdom, it's not cool to be gay, especially if you're the crown prince. So he, in secret, he meets Wolf. And at the time, he thinks Wolf is a human. Wolf is a fairy who disguises himself as a human. So they meet, and it's a little unclear if it was like on purpose or if Wolf kind of bumbled his way through things and kind of just like found an opportunity and took it, or if he like had intent to do this. But either way, Wolf and Callum fall in love, and Wolf proposes to Callum secretly behind Callum's family's back, and Callum says yes. And by doing that, by exchanging rings, Callum accidentally gets his kingdom turned into a fairy wood, and Wolf becomes the king of this fairy court. So the human lands are all turned into this fairy woods. It fills up with fairies. Basically all the humans in the country are like either slaughtered by fairies or like cursed by them, or they get chased out. It's very bad for the humans. Everspring is turned into the Eastern Kingdom, the Eastern Fairy Kingdom. And Wolf turns Callum's family into statues. His mom and dad become statues. He leaves Callum's sister Sarah alone. And the reason he turns the mom and dad into stone is because Callum, when they were dating, Callum told him like, oh, my parents really overbearing. I really wish they'd just go away. And so Wolf took it very seriously and was like, I will make them go away. And Callum's like, no, my parents, why? So Callum is very dismayed. He feels very betrayed that Wolf was actually a fairy the whole time and he didn't tell him. And he's taken over his kingdom, and it seems like, this was just like a power grab. He doesn't actually love me. And so for a long time, Callum just doesn't trust Wolf anymore. And Wolf is like, what's the problem? I made your life better. I got rid of your mean parents. And Callum's like, this isn't what I wanted. So they fight for a little while. Much more plotty stuff happens. There's going to be another talk about this RP There's going to be many more. It is our current RP that we're into, which is why we wanted to do a lot of talks about it, because we're really into it right now. So I won't go into too many details. I'll just talk about Wolf and Callum's relationship. For a little while, Callum turns into a stool. A footstool, I should say. So like at first, Wolf doesn't see anything wrong. He's like ordering the human servants around. He's building up his court. He needs to invite other like fairy lords and ladies to his court so that he can actually like be powerful compared to the other fairy courts that have been established for a lot longer. So in the meantime, he's like ordering servants around and like having a great time because he doesn't see anything wrong with any of this. He starts using Callum as a footstool because he is a silly fairy who thinks it's funny. And so because of the way the magic works with fairies is it's very suggestible to humans. So if a fairy can convince you of something, like they could say like your hair is now red and you actually have like, I don't know, brown hair. If they convince you that your hair is red, your hair will turn red. And the only way to really undo it, you can get the fairy to break the curse, or you can undo it by not believing in it anymore. However, curses leave a little bit of a scar on you, so for that example, your hair will always be a little bit red, a little bit more red than it used to be, because it left that magical scar on you. So Callum, for a little while, he is so upset with himself that he's like, oh my god, I let my kingdom down, everyone's been massacred by fairies, my sister hates me because she's got a very like mean personality, and she was already mean to Callum, but she gets extra mean after the fairy thing, obviously, because she's really upset and feels betrayed by all this as well. He's just like, I've let everyone down, I'm the worst, I wish I would just go away. So he starts turning into a stool, because he convinces himself that he's about as useful as a footstool. So he starts he can't move, he gets all stiff, and like, I think at one point Wolf pushes him over and he just stays and like, with his arms stuck out. And so when Wolf notices that he's like turning into a piece of furniture, he's like, I don't like this. Turn back, I miss talking to you. And Caleb's like, no, I'm useless, and I don't know how to turn back. You did this. And Wolf's like, I didn't really do it. You're kind of doing it to yourself. And he's like, go away, and they fight. But eventually, I think Wolf, like, snuggles Callum up into, like, a little bed and starts giving him, like, food and stuff, and it makes him feel more human again. So he stops turning into a footstool. He turns back to normal. Though I'm sure he's now a little more, like, has a little more trouble bending his limbs now with the magical scarring and everything. But slowly, as they start dealing with, like, the fairy court stuff and Callum trying to bargain with fairies to, like, save his servants, because when the fairies show up, they start, like, murdering and cursing servants, and he's like, no, we gotta stop this, I gotta save people. He starts working with Wolf more, and they get talking again. He does a lot to save his sister from being murdered by fairies, and eventually Wolf and him kind of like apologize, I guess. Well, Wolf apologizes first. He's like, I didn't mean to upset you, I feel like I've screwed everything up, I miss you, I didn't mean to make you so upset. I just thought you didn't want your parents around anymore, and I didn't mean to, like, make you so upset. And Callum's like, I know you didn't realize this was bad because you're a fairy, and, you know, we'll work through it. And they start to, like, trust each other more. And so as they start falling back in love, their hearts begin to meld, because with fairies, when they fall in love or when they get married, their hearts merge as one, and they kind of turn into each other a little bit. There's another important character in it who I'll get into in another video, where she married a troll, so her personality becomes a lot more trollish. She gets, like, angrier and meaner, when before she was a lot, like, sweeter and more gentle-natured. But Callum, being a human who's falling in love with a fairy, he starts to get, like, fairy features. So he gets, like, pointed ears at first. He starts turning kind of blue because Wolf is a snow fairy. I'll get into it in a second. But Callum starts getting fairy features, especially like features that look like wolf. So he starts turning a little blue. He gets like fluffy wolf ears, and he starts acting a little more fairy-ish. And eventually Wolf proposes to him again. He's like, I want to get married to you. And Callum is nervous at first, but eventually he accepts as their relationship gets better. Right, so Wolf, he's like a snow, he's not a spirit, he's like a snow fairy. And the reason he is associated with like snow and ice is because, so in this world, the fairies are created, sorry, not all fairies, I should clarify. So there's like a whole bunch of different kinds of fairies. There's like trolls and ogres and nymphs and sprites and spirits, and there's lords and ladies. So the lords and ladies are like, they can rule kingdoms, they can be part of courts, they can preside over a season in a court. But lords and ladies are created through like exceptional circumstances. Like they're not born. Like they don't have like a mom and dad who have a baby. It's more like, well, in Wolf's case, he was turned into a fairy lord. At first, he was a wolf. He was just like a little wolf hanging out. And then he was struck by thunder snow. So like a lightning storm in winter, he gets struck by lightning. So he is then born into a fairy lord. And so he is associated with like storms and winter and ice. He likes to, instead of drinking water, he likes to eat ice cubes because he likes ice so much. He kind of turns the castle all wintry when he takes over it. Yeah, so that's Wolf. He bumbles around quite a bit because he's a sweetie. He didn't want to really take over, I don't think. At least like he didn't intend it to go as far as it did. He's not very wrathful, he's not a very strict king, he kind of lets people do whatever they want. So like, if anyone in the court, whether it's like one of his lords or ladies, or if it's just like some human or a small fairy or something, if they ask him for something, he'll usually say yes. Unless he's been told specifically by like Callum or another fairy lord or lady to not do that. He doesn't want to hurt people's feelings, but he's willing to like negotiate and like do things for people because he's very like kind-natured, I guess. So anyways, Wolf and Callum, they do eventually get married, and that fully turns Callum into a fairy, and it makes him a fairy king. So he is one of the most powerful fairies in the land. He can start ordering around the fairies that were torturing him and his family earlier, and he basically goes from a human to a very powerful fairy. Currently, where we've left off the RP, their court has been flooded by monsters. And yeah, Wolf has been dragged off to an evil kingdom, and Callum is gonna go save him. Ooh. But yeah, they're really cute. A lot of the other fairies start being really nice to Callum and treating him like an authority figure, and he kind of gets more respect than he ever did when his parents ruled over the country. So he's like, I really like these fairies, but I still feel bad that I'm betraying all the humans, and he's just kind of trying his best to do the right thing, and so is Wolf. But yeah, they're really cute. Doot doot doot. I think that's all I have. Thank you so much for watching. I'm gonna try and get back in my rhythm. If you have any questions, or you'd like to request a video topic, please leave a comment down below. If you want more videos about RPs and comics, make sure to subscribe. And also, we're not streaming today. We're streaming tomorrow on Sunday, so we'll see you there. Okay, goodbye.